A new beginning. Cora Simmons tightened her apron and adjusted the pin-striped uniform jacket that fit snugly over her shoulders. At 62 years old, she was starting over yet again. This time, as a maid at the illustrious Monarch Crown Hotel, a place where opulence met excess, and the rich wielded their privilege like a scepter. Her hands, rough from decades of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, smoothed over the fabric one last time before she exited her small, windowless employee dormitory. Today was her first shift, and despite her nerves, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had weathered life's storms. The Monarch Crown wasn't just a hotel. It was an empire of marble and gold. The grandiose chandelier in the lobby sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting its glow on floors polished to a mirror shine. Cora couldn't help but glance around in awe as she shuffled quietly past the reception desk, her service cart rattling softly in the plush, carpeted corridors. It was worlds away from the greasy diner she had worked at for 2 decades before it shuttered its doors, leaving her adrift. Cora Simmons. A sharp voice broke her reverie. She turned to see Ms. Delaney, the head housekeeper, striding toward her. Dressed in a perfectly tailored blazer, Ms. Delaney exuded authority and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her clipboard was tucked under one arm, and her eyes scanned Cora with a mix of scrutiny and mild disinterest. "Yes, ma'am," Cora replied, keeping her voice even. "You'll be assigned to the East Wing today. Start with the standard suites, but be ready. We've got a high-profile VIP checking in this afternoon, Mr. Ethan Blackwell. Whatever he needs, make sure it's handled promptly. Do you understand?" Cora nodded, masking the sudden jolt of anxiety. She'd dealt with demanding guests before, but the weight of working at such an upscale establishment made her feel like she was tiptoeing on thin ice. "Good. Don't disappoint me," Ms. Delaney said briskly before turning on her heel and walking away. As Cora pushed her cart toward the service elevator, she couldn't shake the unease creeping into her chest. The grandeur of the hotel felt suffocating, as if it was a constant reminder of how far removed she was from the lives of those who stayed there. The first few hours of her shift passed without incident. Cora worked methodically, her movements precise and practiced. She replaced linens, fluffed pillows, and scrubbed marble bathrooms until they gleamed. It was hard, honest work, something she had grown accustomed to over the years. But as the clock ticked closer to noon, the whispers among the staff grew louder. "He's here," one of the younger maids murmured as she passed Cora in the hallway. "Ethan Blackwell just checked in." Cora didn't respond, keeping her focus on her task. She'd heard enough about men like Blackwell. Wealthy, powerful, and often indifferent to the struggles of those who catered to their every whim. But her resolve to remain unnoticed faltered when the sound of heavy footsteps and an entourage of voices filled the corridor. She turned her head slightly, just in time to catch a glimpse of him. Ethan Blackwell walked with the air of a man who owned not just the hotel but the world itself. His tailored suit was as sharp as his features, and the assistants flanking him seemed to hang on his every word. Behind them, bellhops struggled under the weight of designer luggage. Cora instinctively stepped aside, pressing herself against the wall as they passed. For a brief moment, Blackwell's eyes flicked toward her. "You there," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Make sure my suite is spotless. I expect perfection." Cora's lips parted to reply, but he had already turned away, his focus back on his phone. She stood frozen, her heart pounding as the entourage disappeared into the elevator at the end of the hall. By late afternoon, the weight of Blackwell's words lingered heavily on Cora. She had been tasked with delivering a bottle of their finest champagne to his suite, a task that should have been simple but felt monumental. She triple-checked the silver tray, ensuring the crystal flute and linen napkin were perfectly arranged before stepping into the elevator. When she reached his suite, she hesitated. The ornate double doors seemed to loom over her, a barrier between her and a world she could never belong to. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand and knocked. "Come in," came the sharp reply. Cora pushed the door open and stepped inside. The suite was as extravagant as she had imagined, with gold accents and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Ethan Blackwell sat in an armchair near the window, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. "Your champagne, sir," Cora said, her voice steadied despite the tightness in her chest. Blackwell gestured toward the coffee table without looking at her. As Cora set the tray down, she could feel his eyes on her again, appraising her like one might a piece of furniture. "Tell me," he said suddenly, "how long have you worked here?" "Just a few days, sir," Cora replied, straightening up. "And what did you do before this?" "I've worked in service jobs for most of my life," she said cautiously, unsure of where the conversation was heading. Blackwell chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Service jobs? Of course. People like you always end up in positions like this. No ambition, no drive, just cleaning up after others." Cora's hands tightened at her sides, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on a spot on the carpet. "Well," Blackwell continued, leaning back in his chair, "you should be grateful. Working here is probably the best you'll ever do." The words stung, each syllable landing like a blow. But Cora held her composure, bowing her head slightly before murmuring, "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Blackwell waved a dismissive hand. "No, you can go." Cora turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate. But as she exited the suite and the door clicked shut behind her, the weight of the encounter pressed down on her shoulders. She paused in the hallway, taking a moment to steady herself before returning to her duties. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. By the next morning, a simple knock on Blackwell's door would set into motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Behind the closed door, Cora woke up the next morning to the sound of her alarm blaring, pulling her from a restless sleep. The encounter with Ethan Blackwell lingered in her mind like a shadow, his condescending words echoing long after she had finished her shift. She sat on the edge of her bed, her calloused hands clasped tightly together, as she tried to summon the strength to face another day. For all her years of endurance, moments like these chipped away at her resolve. The employee shuttle ride to the Monarch Crown was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional cough from the driver. The other staff members greeted Cora with polite nods, but the camaraderie that often came with shared struggle was absent here. Everyone seemed to be in their own bubble, preoccupied with the weight of maintaining the perfection that the hotel demanded. When Cora arrived at the service entrance, Ms. Delaney was already there, clipboard in hand and lips pursed in her usual expression of impatience. "Johnson," Ms. Delaney said curtly, not bothering to look up from her notes. "Mr. Blackwell has requested you personally to deliver his breakfast this morning. Room service will prepare the tray. Be punctual and remember, he's an important guest. We cannot afford any mistakes." Cora nodded, her stomach nodding. Of all the guests in the hotel, Blackwell was the last person she wanted to face again so soon. But arguing was futile. She simply murmured, "Yes, Mom," and made her way to the staff kitchen. The tray was already waiting for her when she arrived. A plate of eggs Benedict, a bowl of fresh fruit, and a steaming cup of black coffee. Every item was meticulously arranged, the kind of presentation that would impress even the most critical eye. As Cora carefully balanced the tray and headed toward the elevator, she tried to steady her nerves. She reminded herself of the mantra she had relied on for decades: "Get through today. Tomorrow will take care of itself." The elevator ride to the top floor felt interminable. Each ding of the passing floors heightened her anxiety. By the time she reached Blackwell's suite, her palms were slick with sweat. She adjusted her grip on the tray and raised her hand to knock, her knuckles barely brushing the door before his voice rang out. "Come in." Cora pushed the door open, stepping inside with the tray balanced carefully in her hands. The suite was bathed in morning light, the golden hues streaming through the massive windows casting an almost heavenly glow on the expensive furnishings. Blackwell sat at the dining table near the window, his gaze fixed on a tablet in front of him. He didn't look up as Cora approached. "Your breakfast, sir," she said softly, setting the tray down on the table with practiced precision. For a moment, there was silence. Cora stood there, waiting for his acknowledgement or dismissal, unsure which would come first. Then, without lifting his eyes from the tablet, Blackwell spoke. "Stay." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Cora's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is there something else you need, sir?" Finally, Blackwell looked up. His piercing gray eyes studied her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm curious," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What's it like to work here?" Cora blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It's fine, sir," she replied cautiously. "The staff is professional, and the environment is very upscale." Blackwell's smirk widened. "Upscale. That's one way to put it." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Do you enjoy it? Being surrounded by luxury you'll never have?" The bluntness of his words hit like a slap. Cora's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I take pride in doing my job well, sir," she said evenly. Blackwell chuckled, a low, condescending sound, spoken like a true servant. He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, his gaze never leaving her. "Do you know why I'm here, Mrs. Simmons?" Cora shook her head, her fingers gripping the edge of her apron. "Business," he said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "A merger worth billions. It'll change the lives of thousands of people, but not in the way you might think. Jobs will be lost, entire communities disrupted. But that's the cost of progress." Cora's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She could feel the weight of his words, the casual dismissal of lives that would be upended by his decisions. It was a stark reminder of the divide between their worlds. "Do you believe in progress, Mrs. Simmons?" Blackwell asked, tilting his head as he studied her. "I believe in fairness," she said quietly, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. Blackwell's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of intrigue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Fairness," he repeated, as if testing the word. "That's a quaint idea. But the world isn't fair, is it? People like you work your whole lives and end up here, cleaning up after people like me. Do you think that's fair?" Cora met his gaze, her voice steady. "Fairness isn't about where you start or end, sir. It's about treating people with dignity along the way." The room fell silent. Blackwell's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in the air that made Cora's skin prickle. After what felt like an eternity, he leaned back and waved a hand dismissively. "You can go now," he said, his tone abrupt. Cora nodded, her heart pounding as she turned and left the room. The moment the door closed behind her, she exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. She had stood her ground, but at what cost? Men like Blackwell didn't forget challenges to their authority, no matter how subtle. The rest of Cora's shift passed in a haze. She moved through the motions of her tasks, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. By the time she returned to her dormitory that evening, she was emotionally drained. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small clock on the nightstand. It was nearly midnight when a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Miss Delaney standing there, her face tight with concern. "Cora, there's been a complaint," Ms. Delaney said. "Mr. Blackwell has requested a meeting with you tomorrow morning. He wasn't specific, but he's displeased." Cora's stomach sank. A meeting with Blackwell. Displeased? The words churned in her mind, each one more foreboding than the last. As Ms. Delaney walked away, Cora closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it. But for the first time in years, a seed of defiance stirred within her. Blackwell could try to intimidate her, humiliate her, even break her. But she wasn't going to let him strip away her dignity without a fight. The meeting. Cora barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, Ethan Blackwell's piercing gaze haunted her, his condescending tone echoing in her mind. By the time her alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., she was already awake, sitting at the small desk in her dormitory, with a steaming cup of tea she hadn't touched. The prospect of meeting Blackwell again filled her with equal parts dread and defiance. What complaint could he possibly have, and why would he demand to speak with her directly? The staff cafeteria was unusually quiet that morning, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Whispers of Blackwell's infamous temper had already begun circulating. Cora's fellow employees offered her sympathetic glances as she passed, but no one dared speak openly about the situation. She wasn't sure if their silence stemmed from fear of management or the understanding that nothing they could say would change her fate. At exactly 8:00 a.m., Cora stood outside Blackwell's suite. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, the starched fabric of her uniform stiff against her fingers. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before raising her hand to knock. The sound reverberated in the hallway, each tap like a drumbeat heralding her doom. "Come in," Blackwell's voice called from within. Cora pushed the door open and stepped inside. The suite was immaculate, the golden morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows highlighting the pristine surfaces. Blackwell sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. His sharp suit and carefully styled hair were as impeccable as ever, a stark contrast to Cora's plain uniform and weary expression. "Ah, Mrs. Simmons," he said, setting the tablet down and leaning back in his chair. "Punctual. I appreciate that." Cora nodded, unsure how to respond. She stood just inside the door, her posture rigid, as if bracing for an impact. "Come closer," Blackwell said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit." The request startled her. She had expected to be reprimanded while standing like a scolded child, not invited to sit at the same table as him. Warily, she moved forward and lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Blackwell studied her for a long moment, his piercing gray eyes scanning her face as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked finally. Cora shook her head. "No, sir." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers. "Yesterday, during our interaction, I noticed something about you. You're different from the others. Most people in your position would have groveled or apologized profusely, but you didn't. You stood there, calm and composed, as if you're better than this." The accusation stung, but Cora held her tongue. She refused to rise to his bait. "Tell me," Blackwell continued, "what brought you here, to the monarch crown? You're not young, and this kind of work is grueling even for those half your age. Why do it?" Cora hesitated, weighing her response. Finally, she said, "Because it's honest work. And because I don't have the luxury of not working, sir." Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Honest work? Do you find dignity in scrubbing floors and cleaning up after people who don't even see you?" Cora's jaw tightened. Dignity doesn't come from the work itself. It comes from how you carry yourself while doing it. For the first time, Blackwell seemed taken aback. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Simmons, you intrigue me. Most people in your position would be cowed by now, but you're not. I admire that, even if I don't fully understand it." Cora's brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't the reprimand she had been expecting. What was his angle? Blackwell's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Let's test this dignity of yours, shall we? I'm hosting a dinner tonight in the private ballroom. Some of the most influential people in the city will be there. You'll be assigned to serve during the event. Consider it an opportunity to prove yourself." Cora's heart sank. She had heard horror stories about the high-pressure environment of VIP events, where even the smallest mistake could have catastrophic consequences for the staff involved. But refusing was not an option. "I'll do my best, sir," she said quietly. "I expect nothing less," Blackwell replied, his smirk widening. "You're dismissed." Cora stood and walked to the door, her steps measured and deliberate. As she reached for the handle, Blackwell's voice stopped her. "One more thing, Mrs. Simmons," he said. "Don't disappoint me." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Cora was assigned to a team of senior staff tasked with setting up the private ballroom. The space was transformed into a vision of opulence, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables adorned with fine china and gold-plated cutlery. Every detail, from the floral arrangements to the placement of the napkins, was meticulously scrutinized. By the time the event began, Cora's nerves were frayed. She stood at the edge of the room, a tray of champagne flutes balanced expertly in her hands, watching as the city's elite filed in. The men wore tailored suits, the women shimmering gowns, and their laughter filled the air like the tinkling of glass. Blackwell was at the center of it all, charming his guests with an ease that belied the sharpness of his tongue. Cora observed him from a distance, her expression carefully neutral. He was a man who thrived on control, and tonight the room was his stage. The evening progressed smoothly, the staff moving like clockwork to ensure every guest's needs were met. But as the night wore on, Cora began to notice the subtle dynamics at play. Blackwell's charm was a mask, and beneath it lay a man who wielded his power with calculated precision. He praised some guests while subtly undermining others, his words laced with double meanings that left his target scrambling to save face. At one point, he caught Cora's eye across the room and raised his glass in a mock toast. The gesture sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder that she was still part of whatever game he was playing. As the event wound down, Cora found herself summoned to Blackwell's table. He sat with a small group of guests, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to approach. "Mrs. Simmons," he said smoothly, "this is the woman I was telling you about. A model of dignity in the face of adversity." Cora felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't sure if his words were meant as praise or mockery. "Tell us, Mrs. Simmons," Blackwell continued, his tone deceptively conversational. "What's the secret to maintaining one's dignity when life gives you nothing but hardship?" The table fell silent, all eyes on her. Cora's heart raced, but she lifted her chin and met Blackwell's gaze. "The secret, sir, is to never let anyone make you feel small," she said evenly, "no matter how they try." For a moment, Blackwell said nothing. Then, to her astonishment, he began to clap. The sound was slow and deliberate, his smirk returning as the other guests joined in, their laughter mingling with the applause. Cora's stomach churned, whatever game Blackwell was playing. The breaking point. Cora returned to her dormitory that night drained in every sense of the word. The applause that had followed her response to Ethan Blackwell's taunting had rung hollow, a performance orchestrated by a man who seemed to revel in making her squirm. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the walls of the small room she now called home. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, the weight of the evening pressing down on her like a physical burden. For years, Cora had endured. She had smiled through indignities, bitten her tongue when faced with cruelty, and prided herself on her resilience. But tonight, something within her shifted. Blackwell's mockery had touched a nerve she hadn't realized was so raw. His calculated game, the way he paraded her in front of his guests, had stripped away the shield of quiet dignity she had relied on for so long. As she prepared for bed, her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't silence. What was Blackwell's endgame? Why single her out? The question swirled as exhaustion eventually overtook her, pulling her into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams. The next morning, Cora was summoned to Ms. Delaney's office before her shift. The head housekeeper's expression was unreadable as Cora stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. "Mrs. Simmons," Delaney began, her tone clipped. "Mr. Blackwell has requested your presence again this evening. He's hosting a smaller gathering, and he specifically asked that you serve his table." Cora's stomach churned. The previous night had been humiliating enough. The thought of enduring another evening under Blackwell's scrutiny made her want to scream. "Is there a problem?" Delaney asked, raising an eyebrow. Cora shook her head, forcing a neutral expression. "No, Mom." "Good. You're dismissed," Delaney said, turning back to her paperwork. As Cora left the office, a mix of dread and determination coursed through her. If Blackwell wanted to play games, she would endure. She had no choice. But something deep inside whispered that she couldn't let this continue unchecked. That evening, the gathering in Blackwell's suite was markedly different from the previous night's grand event. A handful of guests lounged in the opulent living area, their laughter subdued but no less tinged with an air of exclusivity. Cora moved silently between them, her tray balanced perfectly as she offered glasses of wine and hors d'oeuvres. Blackwell sat in a high-backed chair near the window, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. He watched Cora with the intensity of a predator observing its prey. She avoided his eyes, focusing instead on her tasks, but she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her. "Mrs. Simmons," Blackwell called, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Cora froze, then turned and walked toward him, her tray held steady. "Yes, sir." "Set that down," he said, gesturing to a nearby table. "I have a question for you." She complied, placing the tray down carefully before standing with her hands clasped in front of her. The other guests watched with mild curiosity, their expressions ranging from amusement to indifference. "Tell me, Mrs. Simmons," Blackwell said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you believe in loyalty?" Cora blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Loyalty is important, sir," she replied cautiously. "Interesting," Blackwell said, his lips curving into a smirk. "And do you think loyalty should be rewarded?" "I believe loyalty should be mutual," Cora said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. Blackwell chuckled, a low, mocking sound, spoken like someone who's never had power. "Loyalty, Mrs. Simmons, is a commodity, and like any commodity, it has a price." The room fell silent, all eyes on Cora. She could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken expectation that she would respond in a way that entertained them. "With respect, sir," she said finally, her voice firm, "loyalty that can be bought isn't loyalty at all. It's just business." Blackwell's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and Cora felt a flicker of satisfaction. But the moment was short-lived. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're an interesting woman, Mrs. Simmons," he said, perhaps too interesting. Before she could process his words, one of the guests laughed, breaking the tension in the room. The conversation shifted, and Cora took the opportunity to step away, her heart pounding. Later that night, as Cora cleared the empty glasses and plates from the suite, Blackwell approached her. The other guests had left, and the room was eerily quiet. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his tone softer than before, "do you ever wonder what it would be like to be on the other side of all this?" Cora straightened, meeting his gaze. "I try not to dwell on things I can't change, sir." Blackwell nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "What if I told you that you could? That with the right opportunities, you might find yourself in a very different position." Cora frowned, unsure of what he was implying. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." Blackwell stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You intrigue me, Mrs. Simmons. Your composure, your resilience. It's rare, and I've learned to value rarity." Cora's pulse quickened. Whatever Blackwell was suggesting, it felt like a dangerous game she wasn't sure she wanted to play. "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, stepping back. "But I'm quite content with where I am." Blackwell's smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Contentment, Mrs. Simmons, is the enemy of ambition. Think about it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Cora standing alone in the empty suite. She stared after him, her mind racing. For the first time since she had started at the Monarch Crown, she felt genuinely afraid, not for her job, but for what Blackwell's interest in her might mean. As she finished her tasks and left the suite, Cora resolved to tread carefully. Whatever Blackwell's motives, she couldn't afford to let him unsettle her. She had spent her life building a fortress of resilience around herself, and she wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. But deep down, she knew that the events of the evening had already cracked the foundation. A line in the sand. Cora arrived for her next shift to find the hotel in a state of barely contained chaos. A new wave of high-profile guests was expected that evening, and the staff bustled with nervous energy. Instructions were barked in clipped tones, lists were checked and rechecked, and every corner of the monarch crown was scrutinized to ensure perfection. But beneath the surface, whispers about Ethan Blackwell's peculiar interest in Cora had begun to circulate among her colleagues. She could feel their eyes on her as she navigated the staff corridors, their glances a mix of curiosity and pity. One maid, a young woman named Maria, approached her near the staff lockers. "Mrs. Simmons," Maria began hesitantly, her voice low. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time around Mr. Blackwell. Are you okay? He's not exactly known for being kind." Cora offered a faint smile, touched by Maria's concern. "I'm fine, dear. Just doing my job." Maria nodded but didn't look convinced. "Well, if you need anything, I'm here. Some of the things people say about him, they're not good." As Maria walked away, Cora's resolve hardened. She had no intention of letting Blackwell's games define her time at the monarch crown. Whatever he was planning, she would handle it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. Later that evening, as the city's elite began arriving, Cora found herself stationed in the main dining room. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow over the meticulously set tables. Guests in designer suits and glittering gowns mingled, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Cora moved among them with practiced grace, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. She had just finished serving one group when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with Blackwell, his sharp gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mrs. Simmons," he said smoothly, "walk with me." Cora hesitated, glancing around the room. The other staff members were busy with their tasks, and none of the guests seemed to notice Blackwell's summons. Reluctantly, she set down her tray and followed him as he led her toward a quieter corner of the dining room. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," Blackwell began, his tone deceptively casual. "About loyalty and ambition." Cora said nothing, keeping her expression neutral. She knew better than to offer him anything he could twist into a weapon. "You're a fascinating woman, Mrs. Simmons," he continued. "Most people in your position would have crumbled by now. But you endure. I find that admirable." "Thank you, sir," Cora replied evenly, though her stomach churned. Blackwell's lips curved into a faint smile. "Do you know what separates people like me from people like you?" Cora met his gaze, her voice steady. "Opportunity, sir." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, it's the willingness to take risks, to seize power when it's within reach. That's why I'm at the top, and you," he gestured vaguely at her uniform, "are here." "If that's what you believed, sir," Cora said, her tone calm but firm. Blackwell's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, they stood in silence, the din of the dining room fading into the background. "You're different," he said finally, "and that intrigues me. But it also makes me wonder how far you're willing to go to protect that so-called dignity of yours." Cora felt a chill run through her. Blackwell's words were a challenge, a test she hadn't agreed to take. "Excuse me, sir," she said, taking a small step back. "I need to return to my duties." Blackwell studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. But remember, Mrs. Simmons, the higher the stakes, the greater the reward." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Cora couldn't shake the unease that lingered from her interaction with Blackwell. As she returned to the staff dormitory that night, her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that Blackwell's interest in her wasn't merely a passing curiosity. There was something deeper at play, something that felt both dangerous and unavoidable. The next morning, Cora was summoned to Ms. Delaney's office again. This time, the head housekeeper's expression was grim. "Mrs. Simmons," Delaney began, folding her hands on the desk. "It seems Mr. Blackwell has made another request. He wants you to accompany him on a business trip." Cora's breath caught. "A business trip," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Delaney said, her tone clipped. "He's leaving for his estate in the countryside tomorrow, and insists you join the staff attending him. It's highly unusual, but Mr. Blackwell is a VIP guest, and we must accommodate his wishes." Cora felt the walls closing in around her. A trip to the countryside meant isolation. Far from the safety of the bustling hotel and her colleagues, it meant being at Blackwell's mercy. "Ms. Delaney," Cora began, her voice trembling, "is there no one else who can go?" Delaney shook her head, her expression unsympathetic. "He specifically requested you, Mrs. Simmons. Refusing isn't an option." As Cora left the office, her mind raced. Blackwell's interest in her had escalated, and she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being drawn into a game she didn't understand. But one thing was clear: she needed to find a way to regain control. That evening, as she prepared for the trip, Cora sat at the small desk in her dormitory, pen in hand. She began writing a letter to Maria, the young maid who had shown her kindness. If anything happened, she wanted someone to know the truth. "Maria," she wrote, her hand trembling slightly, "I'm not sure what's ahead, but I have a feeling it won't be easy. If I don't return, please know I tried my best to stay true to who I am. Don't let anyone take that from you." She folded the letter and tucked it into an envelope, placing it in the drawer of her desk. Then she sat back, her heart heavy with uncertainty, but her resolve unwavering. Whatever Blackwell had planned, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. Tomorrow would bring new trials, but tonight, Cora allowed herself a moment of peace. The battle wasn't over, and she wasn't about to back down. A reckoning. The countryside estate loomed ahead as the sleek black car turned onto the winding gravel driveway. Cora sat in the backseat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air outside was crisp, the sprawling grounds framed by towering trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. Yet the beauty of the scene did little to soothe her nerves. She was acutely aware of Blackwell's presence beside her, his attention fixed on his phone, his expression unreadable. When the car finally stopped in front of the grand mansion, Blackwell glanced at her briefly. "Welcome to my retreat, Mrs. Simmons," he said with a faint smirk. "I trust you'll find the accommodations adequate." Cora didn't respond, stepping out of the car and taking in the estate. The mansion was an architectural marvel, with large bay windows and ivy creeping along its stone facade. Staff members were already bustling about, unloading luggage and preparing for what promised to be an eventful weekend. Blackwell strode ahead without waiting for her, his presence as commanding as ever. A middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform approached Cora, her expression warm but professional. "You must be Mrs. Simmons," she said. "I'm Evelyn, the house manager. Let me show you to your quarters." Evelyn led Cora through the mansion, pointing out key areas and giving a brief overview of her duties for the weekend. Cora listened intently, noting the lavish decor and the hushed efficiency of the staff. She was given a small but comfortable room near the service wing, its simplicity a stark contrast to the grandeur of the rest of the estate. As she unpacked her few belongings, Cora's mind raced. The isolation of the estate made her uneasy, but she reminded herself of the letter she'd left behind. At least someone would know if things went awry. The first evening at the estate was relatively uneventful. Blackwell hosted an intimate dinner with a handful of guests, their conversation veering between business deals and idle gossip. Cora moved quietly among them, serving wine and clearing plates with practiced efficiency. She avoided Blackwell's gaze, focusing on her tasks and trying to remain invisible. But as the night wore on, she couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the room. Blackwell's demeanor was sharper than usual, his words laced with veiled barbs that seemed to keep his guests on edge. At one point, he caught her eye and held her gaze for a moment too long, a faint smile playing on his lips. Cora's unease deepened. After the dinner ended and the guests retired to their rooms, Cora lingered in the dining hall, tidying up the last of the dishes. Evelyn entered, her expression concerned. "How are you holding up?" Evelyn asked softly. Cora hesitated before answering. "I'm managing. Thank you for asking." Evelyn nodded, but her eyes lingered on Cora. "Be careful with Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice low. "He's not someone you want to cross." Cora's chest tightened, but she forced a small smile. "I'll keep that in mind." The next day brought a new set of challenges. Blackwell had arranged for a series of outdoor activities, and the staff worked tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. Cora was assigned to oversee refreshments for the guests, a task that required her to stay close to Blackwell and his entourage. As the day wore on, Cora became increasingly aware of Blackwell's attempts to draw her into conversation. He asked her opinion on trivial matters, made pointed remarks about her persistence, and seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort. His guests watched with thinly veiled amusement, their laughter echoing across the estate. By the time the sun began to set, Cora felt as though she'd been walking on a tightrope all day. But it was during the evening's cocktail hour that everything came to a head. Blackwell's guests were gathered in the grand living room, their glasses filled with expensive champagne. Cora stood near the edge of the room, her tray balanced in her hands, when Blackwell addressed her directly. "Mrs. Simmons," he called, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Come here." The room fell silent as Cora approached, every eye on her. Blackwell gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Sit," he said. Cora hesitated, her heart pounding. "Sir, I—" "Sit," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Cora lowered herself into the chair, her hands resting in her lap. Blackwell leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You've worked hard these past few days," he said, his voice deceptively smooth. "But I can't help but wonder, what drives you? What keeps you going when most people would have given up long ago?" Cora met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I've had no choice but to keep going, sir. Life doesn't pause for anyone." Blackwell's smirk widened. "And yet, here you are, enduring. Why?" Cora straightened her spine, her resolve hardening. "Because I believe in dignity, sir. And no matter how hard life gets, I refuse to let anyone take that from me." Cora straightened her spine, her resolve hardening. "Because I believe in dignity, sir. And no matter how hard life gets, I refuse to let anyone take that from me." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Blackwell's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. Then he laughed, a low, mirthless sound that sent a chill through the room. "Dignity," he repeated. "A noble concept, Mrs. Simmons. But let's see how far it gets you." With that, he stood, gesturing for the guests to follow him. As the room emptied, Cora remained seated, her heart pounding. She had drawn a line, but at what cost? Later that night, as she lay in her small room, Cora replayed the evening's events in her mind. She knew she had stood her ground, but the battle was far from over. Blackwell was a man who thrived on control, and her defiance had undoubtedly stoked his desire to break her. But Cora also knew something he didn't. She had endured far worse than his games. She had faced life's harshest trials and emerged stronger each time. Whatever Blackwell had planned, she was ready. As she drifted off to sleep, a newfound determination settled over her. She would not let him win. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but Cora Simmons was prepared to face them head-on, her dignity intact.